investment. So you want to be serving a large area, which means you want to be in rural communities that can access suburban environments or larger rural communities, which is tough in the drone environment, right? Because as we know, regulators are not keen to allow you to fly over densely populated areas. And with understandable reason, right? The more risk you have in the area is directly tied to the density of the flight environment that you're flying over. So that's the balance that we're constantly doing, is where can we derive the most value? Where can we save the most lives? Where can we make that argument that the flights will have the greatest societal impact with the lowest risk? And then where can we get authorization to fly? So, the value, again, is tremendous if you take into consideration, especially all of those impacts to the system more broadly.
Right. The second bullet here, so routine to emergency infrastructure. I think this can even tie into a little bit to the economic landscape, but a key lesson from the experience here is that drones can be used as emergency infrastructure when they're already serving as routine infrastructure. And I think COVID is probably a great example of this, but what can you talk to us about, setting up the infrastructure and being used for both regular operation and then, when you're called upon when there's an emergency?
Yeah. This gets directly to that question that the person asked before, which is, how do we ensure that this is best utilized across a multitude of operations and mission sets such that, countries and populations get the most value? And what we're finding is that if you do the legwork ahead of time, then this work, or this infrastructure that's purchased, that's invested in, becomes resilience where you didn't think you had any, right? So oftentimes roads can be washed out. In the US even, we have bridges fail. We've got roads that become inoperable. And in those instances, in those times, getting vaccines or getting just-in-time delivery of emergency products is even more important than on an everyday basis. Mm-hmm. And so, what drones become then is not a good to have, but a need to have. Mm-hmm. And so we begin, I do think of drones as infrastructure rather than as a service in many ways. I think that if society began to look at these various fourth industrial revolution technologies as security, as a safety mechanism to meet some of the rising challenges, whether that's climatological or geopolitical or what have you, we'll start to see broader adoption because, we're all interested in investing in infrastructure in the U.S. We're about to see massive investment in infrastructure. And I think that drones certainly have a place in that to meet the rising needs that society sees.
Right. Great. We talked about this a little bit earlier on as well, but sharing the data. Can you talk to us about, what it means to basically have all these flight hours? You mentioned, I think, 1 million or so flights. Can you talk to us just about, collecting all this data and how you think this is going to impact the proliferation of drone technology and drone delivery across the world?
Yeah, so we've done 8.6 million miles flown, right? Okay. And and we've never had an injury from a flight, right? So being able to say that to me reflects an immense investment in safety that demonstrates a safety record that I believe is unparalleled except for traditional aviation, right? We look at what we tolerate in cars on the ground. I think we have 40,000 deaths per year in the United States from car collisions, from automobiles. And society just tolerates that, because we've seen the need. I don't believe we've demonstrated quite that need yet, or maybe we haven't demonstrated that we can fly as safely as that to a degree that people are trustworthy. But for all of the data we do have, we're willing to share it, right? We want to use that as a mechanism to advance and open up the sky for a broader industry community that can meet that same safety level. One thing that I'm constantly advocating for is something like an industry-wide safety reflection. We have the Unmanned Aircraft Safety Team in the United States that's run by the FAA, and We also, have the ASRS database, which is run by NASA, which recently began like a real push to bring unmanned aircraft system self-reporting into the mix to try to advance the industry safety experience to the same degree that traditional aviation is. But I think that oftentimes, companies see data as their secret sauce. The most important thing for drones, if we want to advance the industry, is to not be competing on safety. We need to be, competing on other things, but safety is not a place that we compete. Safety is a place that we work together, and only through sharing data with governments in a protected way will that happen. Now, I know there's also privacy concerns when you share data, right? So if you're delivering medical products, what data you share could reflect individuals' names and backgrounds and ailments. And so protecting the data is very important as well. So it becomes this nuanced approach to really understand, what can be shared, what insights can be gleaned, and working together collaboratively as an industry.
It's interesting. You touched on one of Interdrone's unofficial taglines, and we've said it often, which is "Safety can't be proprietary."
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Yeah. No, that's absolutely right.
Fourth point here: scaling up and spreading out. We kind of touched on this with the Toyota piece, but this article even mentions that in India, the World Economic Forum is working with states as well as central government on its Medicine from the Sky project. It mentions Zipline and the partnership with Japan and Toyota, and then it also mentions Israel recently conducting one of the largest trials of concurrent drone flights. And so I think, we've kind of talked about this point a little bit already, but just taking these learnings and using them elsewhere, I think when the industry is fully integrated and sustainable, there's enough room for a lot of players to participate in it and to bring a lot of value. The last point from this article, so sharing the airspace. The biggest barrier to creating these types of operations around the world remains regulation. Civil aviation authorities face a tough challenge in balancing the safety of existing flight operations and people on the ground while enabling new types of operations. I know you have a big background in regulation. Talk to us just a little bit about, working with aviation authorities and with, different governance bodies that control the airspace in different countries.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that civil aviation regulators, government officials involved in this are some of the best, most motivated, thoughtful people that I've ever worked with, right? And so, I think they get a lot of flack for not moving quick enough, for not being responsive to industry needs. And I'm very sensitive to the challenge that they've been put in, which is a difficult task, almost, out of nowhere, right? I mean, I think we could say that, drones have been coming for decades. In my book, I wrote a book on drone safety risk management for the next evolution of flight. And in that, I kind of go through the history of where, one version of the history of drones, right? I think some people would say there's other histories and things, and that's fine. But, talk about this decade journey of the creation of UAS, but really the push for unmanned aircraft systems on a commercial side didn't really come until about 10 years ago, I would say, and that's very quick in terms of government response. So I'm very sensitive to the challenge that they're seeing and often underfunded and often low resourced. And so, but I would the one thing I would say to regulators and to government officials all over the world is that the industry is past pilot projects. Like, we don't need more pilots and in terms of, experiments. There are some systems that need more evolution. Like unmanned traffic management is something that I think we need to invest in. We need to push. But I mean, how long did it take to go to the moon? And how long have we been trying now to find a regulatory risk analysis process to get drones flying? I think that if we were serious about it, we would say, let's start with the scale that we have today. Let's begin authorizing missions, commercial operations. Let's learn from those commercial operations, and then let's scale them as they maintain safety. Because right now, after 8.6 million miles flown, after 730,000 commercial deliveries, we're ready to fly meaningful operations, as I know our competitors are, right? They're looking to fly and to service society today, right. Which isn't to say there shouldn't be guardrails, right. But I think some regulators, where they've seen the value the most, places like Rwanda and Ghana, have also derived the most value out of what drones can produce, have seen firsthand the lives that can be saved, the effectiveness, the economic viability of this. And it's really a shame where we can't, simply because there's no process for evaluation, even though, these regulators agree that your system is relatively safe. Like, we believe in your system, we just don't have the process in place to authorize it. Switzerland is famous. Their regulators are famous for saying, they're not allowed to say no just because they don't have a process. They have to figure out a reason why no is the right answer, or get to yes. And I really admire that.
Yeah, we brought this up from like more than a dozen angles, as each guest has kind of, from both people that work directly with the FAA at test sites, to people who are more on the private side, who are asking for things to move faster, to even individual pilots that see their rights in jeopardy, and what it all kind of means in totality. The thing that I see, having been to Switzerland, engaged with those regulators versus here, that I think is like an important thing to note, is the structure of that country versus the United States, and where the Civil Aviation Authority sits within that is a little bit different in how it also relates to the private sector. Like in the United States, the FAA is the singular authority, whereas Switzerland is going to have to communicate with Germany, it's going to have to communicate with France, and they're, within the entire European Union. So it actually, there's a kind of move towards compromise faster, because nobody wants to be left behind in that argument. Nobody wants to be the stick in the mud. But also, then they have to consider, well, I can't get everything I want because I have to compromise with these other countries. Whereas the FAA can just say no sometimes. It's like, well, we don't have resources allocated for that. Maybe when the next administration comes in, we can help you. That's not an exact quote from anybody, but sometimes it does feel like that's the tenor. Like, even when there's the will, there's kind of like a lack of institutional momentum to help get things over the hill.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting perspective. I hadn't really heard that one before. And I think there's probably a lot of validity to it. I also think, in the post-Cold War era, or in a post-World War II era, really, the FAA and ICAO have been the, and more recently EASA, but really the FAA has led international standards for quite a lot of civil aviation, right? And a lot of folks, a lot of civil aviations look to the FAA and say, okay, as soon as they determine something, we'll just copy and paste, right? Part 107, 14 CFR 107, is all over the world in various ways, right? The 55 pounds or less, the, no beyond visual line of sight, like that, those were pretty much copied and pasted in, I would say, like 75% of drone regulations around the world. And
that's fascinating, because you could drive a truck through it, like in terms of oversight.
But what it did was it created like a baseline regulatory environment.
We had nothing.
A lot of operations quickly, right? And so the FAA should actually be applauded for being able to set that up.
They did it like it looked like they were behind, and then they just dropped it one day, and we're like, whoa, thank you. That was a lot of movement all at once. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that's very helpful. But the next step is enabling that beyond visual line of sight, the real impact-oriented drone operations. And so since then, we haven't seen nearly as much, operational drive. And I think one of the reasons is because the FAA feels this responsibility so concretely, and with some of the lessons that have been taught, whether that's the 737 MAX or whatever, there's a lot of need to get it right immediately and to think about scale long term, which is great. We want to protect lives, but it also has the effect of slowing down innovation sometimes. In Switzerland, they don't see, like, when they come up with something new, they only will see the competitive advantage, right? They're a relatively small country,
right.
A high technology country. So if they can create a policy that advances the agenda, I think they're willing to take a little bit more risk. And now, again, this isn't directly from the Swiss FOCA, this isn't something they have articulated to me, but from what I've seen internationally, like, that there is a difference in where you sit in terms of the responsibility to the international community.
Well, I'll give a direct quote from somebody from Swiss FOCA to kind of back up the mentality you're seeing. And it was on their slide at the Drone Code conference or Pix4D conference. So you could verify that in the history books. Open source regulation. That was what he called it. And that's an extremely different mentality where the FAA here, I mean, you spoke to the history of success that they have to keep up. In a lot of ways it's a burden. And then also the other consideration, as we've learned from our friends at the test site, is, like you said, preparing for that scalable future. Like, they want to get it right so we could actually scale at an extremely fast rate and be secure for years and not have to reinvent the wheel again,
right.
As we are now.
It's in Switzerland, so it sounds like my good friend Lorenzo, who probably put that on a slide.
No, surprisingly not. But, he's usually the one, because he's
usually the one. I'm sure he had some editing.
He definitely had some influence on it. I could hear his voice in there. Yeah.
But can you imagine if manned aviation or crewed aviation had to evolve in a setting that said, well, someday we're going to have millions of flights of passenger aircraft that are going to be huge, and they're going to have jet engines, and we're going to have active control for all of them, and we're going to be able to have to track them. We haven't heard of tracking. Like, that's not a technology that's even on our radar, so to speak. But we're going to have to create rules that allow for at-scale passenger aircraft in 30 years. In a timeline, the industry would never have taken off. So I think to say that we need to create the perfect rule set today for an at-scale future of millions of drones tomorrow, I would prefer to create a system that allows the scale we're dealing with in the short term and medium term than thinking about the long term immediately. But that's just me.
Yeah, no, it's entrenched perspectives in a lot of cases. I think there was a false equivalency, especially in those, if you're going back 10 years to when I would say 6 years, it really started exploding. That's when Interdrone kind of launched. There was a perspective that these commercial aviation and drone aviation are more equatable than they actually are. And a lot of the kind of perspectives on how we should treat drones from the aviation side down came from that. And as these two communities mingled, actually it was the entrepreneurial kind of big dreamers who were totally off the mark that completely washed out. And I think we've lost a little bit of that spirit of industriousness in an interim period that I'm only starting to see really come back in the last 9 months. A fresh perspective of we could do this, and I know what I'm doing now, which is kind of cool to see.
Well, I definitely feel that way. Having come over to Zipline, I knew Zipline was doing tremendous things. I think a lot of times we think of a drone being flown one operator to one drone, but we're capable of flying one operator to 24 drones without safety concerns. So we're changing the very way we think about what a pilot is, an operator is, a controller is. When I left the World Economic Forum, I said I would only join the drone company that I firmly believed was taking safety seriously, that was working with regulators rather than against regulators. And to me, that's what I've been most impressed with at Zipline.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like kind of an overarching theme is there's more threat to safety of people of holding this technology and not letting them use it than it is to actually using it and risking an incident, right?
Yeah, I mean, to me, there's more risk in not allowing an operation to take place,
right,
than allowing it to take place. And so, but that argument doesn't often get set. It's not often, taken in the regulatory landscape that exists today. In the UK, they had a policy in place that allowed the Civil Aviation Authority specifically to prioritize and evaluate risk differently based on their COVID-19 response, which to me is huge, right? They saw an immediate need. They said drones can respond to COVID-19 and save lives, so we need to rethink how we're approaching the risk approval process. And I believe that should be applied to medical drones more broadly. I mean, obviously, I'm a little bit self-interested in that statement, working in medical logistics, but, whether that's medical, whether it's search and rescue, where drones have been employed to save children lost in forests. In Switzerland, I know they use drones to find patients suffering from dementia out in the cold, wandering through the winter night. And you should be able to prioritize operations that will save lives to, a huge degree versus those that, and those that don't really put anybody at risk.
Right. Yeah, totally agree. Harrison, we have another question from Mark 1075. Have you seen a move to collect microweather data from flight data to improve larger flight or weather mapping?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge piece of beyond visual line of sight operations, is understanding what the microclimate weather looks like. Now, for us, I think you can either look at microclimate weather and say you need to avoid the weather, you need to understand all elements of the environment all the time so that your system can move around it or move above it, right? Or you need to develop a robust system that can fly through it without any problem. I think we're trying to do both, but our focus really has been developing a robust system that can fly through weather rather than avoid weather. One thing that's interesting that I didn't know until I joined Zipline was that some dramatic number of thunderstorms happen along the Rwanda-Uganda border. Something like 40% of all lightning storms happen along that border, just where it is in the world. And so, thunderstorms and torrential downpours are constantly happening in Rwanda where we're flying. And so it was incumbent upon us to make sure that we could fly through it rather than avoid it in order to meet the needs of our customers. So that's what we've done. We've also begun testing in North Dakota for icing to make sure that we can prove that the operations we want to do in tough weather can take place. So yeah, microweather is very important, but our response has been, let's make a system that's robust, that can fly through.
Right. Well, Harrison, I know we only have about 2 minutes left. If you weren't working at Zipline, what do you think you'd be doing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question because I've really found myself in a position where I can make an impact. All the things I would be doing otherwise are things that I get to do at Zipline, right? So being a part of a company that drives impact, that can work towards saving lives, that can work towards making the world a better place, that can work with really smart, dedicated folks. If I wasn't working at Zipline, I might still be at the World Economic Forum working with international governments to drive and to rethink the future state of drone regulation, of technology policy. But frankly, I think I'd also love to work in DC and work with the FAA or the Department of Transportation or the White House to be a part of the solution, to opening up the skies, to investing in our international infrastructure in a way that makes sense for this digital transformation that we're experiencing.
I think that's a great answer. So working to get the same achievement just from maybe a different a different angle or a different part of the piece.
Or sitting on the beach, maybe running a drone rental in Thailand and letting tourists come in and take pictures and just drinking a pina colada.
There you go.
Maybe that would be my real answer.
Also a great option. Any final thoughts? And then, anything you want to share with the audience or in the listeners? And lastly, how can people get in touch, learn a little bit more, about what Zipline's doing, and then, or even get in touch with you?
Sure, yeah. Always tweet at me, Wolf_UAS. Happy to answer questions. Please check out flyzipline.com, www.flyzipline.com. We have all of our customer stories. We have many customer stories, not all of them, but many customer stories that we constantly update the number of flights. Every single minute it's being updated because we're flying constantly. So you can see a live footage of the impact that we're making. I just want to leave by saying that, hey, this has been a great experience. I really appreciate what you guys are doing. I appreciate what Interdrone does. But I've seen a lot of different industries, how they've developed, how they work, especially in technology. And I've really come to respect the people who are passionate in the drone industry. Whether it's the regulator, whether it's private industry, whether it's academia or civil society, we have an amazing overlap between health, technology, international organizations that really care about the state of the world. And it creates this environment of collaboration and safety focus and passion that I don't think you see in a lot of industries. So, for me, thank you, and to thank you to the industry.
Absolutely. I think I can speak for most of us in Interdrone that we agree with that sentiment. So great way to finish it and close us out. Thank you everybody for tuning in. We will be back in about 2 weeks, same time, same place. And thanks again to Harrison and Zipline. Really great conversation. We'll put some links to get in touch with him and to learn a little bit more about Zipline in the description of this podcast. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and have a great rest of your week.
Cheers. Thank you.